People who quit their jobs on the first day. What was your I'm out to here moment? I took a job at a lockdown residential treatment center as I was desperate for a job. The interviewer said most of the kids were court ordered and were a step away from juvie. The interview didn't go well, so I was honestly surprised when they called me offer me the job. The morning of training was going over all of the state and federal laws that governed the place, like resident rights and staff to resident ratios and the like. The afternoon was a tour of the facility, where it became readily apparent that none of the laws we'd just covered were being followed. I left at the end of the day and never came back. I had a feeling something bad was going to happen at that place. A few months later they got shut down after a riot that results in several serious injuries to both residents and staff. Glad I wasn't around for that. Happened to my wife. Fresh out of college with her psych degree, she applied to be a counselor at one of these facilities. During the interview they start talking about training her to physically restrain patients. She's 5'3", 115 pounds, soaking wet as a counselor. It's crazy how sketchy those places can be. Summer job working for a landscape architect. Got to the job site and he asked me to dig a hole in some rocky dirt. I asked for a shovel. He didn't have one. I asked for a hand spade. He didn't have one. He told me to just dig the hole with my bare hands, and then he drove off to another site, leaving me completely alone. I dug for a little bit and then said duck this and left. Had the job specified that I needed to supply my own tools, I called, but it didn't, and I wasn't going to work for somebody that expected folks to dig through hard, rocky soil with their hands. On the first day of working at Amazon warehouse, the managers broke down to everyone how 15-minute break works there. Walking to the break room is 2 minutes. 10 minutes of actual break, and then 2 minutes to go back to your stations. It took me 2 minutes to walk to my car, and I took a forever break. I was 17 and working precast concrete. Refused to use a rusted to shit ladder. Supervisor called me a pussy. Got up about 7 rungs before his foot went through one. Heard his foot snap as he fell. I called an ambulance and walked to my car in the parking lot. Not technically first day but second day, when I was 20 or so. I got hired to be a temporary floor member for Forever 21 during the holiday season. My training started a week before Black Friday, so the store was already kind of in chaos. On my first day of training I walked in, and the floor manager gave all the new hires a tour showing us the facility and layout of the store. After this I was assigned to a veteran floor member to shadow and get an idea of what my job was, and what my duties would be. As soon as I was assigned, the manager dipped, never to be seen again. An hour and a half into my shift, my shadowee got an emergency family call, and had to take off for a week. When this happened I found some other floor manager, and explained the situation, and asked them who else I should shadow. The manager's response was, just do what you can by yourself, you'll be fine. Everyone else is busy. Figured we'll okay, I'll try. I don't know if any of you have shopped in the women's section of Forever 21, but during seasonal sales they will have multiple articles of clothing that all look almost exactly the same, but with slight differences. A white cardigan with 4 buttons that looked literally the same as a white cardigan with 5 buttons. The best part was these different items were often placed in completely separate parts of the store, and it was the job of the dressing room to return the unpurchased items to the correct section, so the employees could put them back on the shelves. Well, these employees' ducking sucked, and I didn't know if they were a part of my section or not, so I'd spend a ridiculous amount of time trying to find where they go, before realizing, wait, this isn't even my section. I've checked literally every rack, so I'd put it back on the sorting rack and move to the next item. More than 50% of the stuff I was told to a shelf wasn't my section. I just did as best as I could and got ready for my next miserable day. The next day I come in, and the store manager pulls me to her office and tells me how slow I was the day before, and if I want to keep working here I need to be very fast. I explained my lack of training and unfamiliarity with the store, and she told me if I didn't know where the clothes were in sections I should come in my free time and memorize where stuff was at. I spent the rest of my shift putting clothes in random ducking places and never came back for a third shift. Duck that place and their management. Answered an ad in the paper. This was the mid-90s, what seemed to be an office job making sales calls when I was in college. Did a phone interview and was called back for an in-person interview. When I go to the interview, I'm led into a room with about 50 other people and a small stage at the front of the room. We're all somewhat confused as to what is going on. Finally, a guy gets on the stage and informs us that we've been selected for the opportunity to sell Cutco. Me and 2/3 of the rest stood up and walked out. A long time ago, not long after getting my papers as a chef, I had an interview at a hotel for a position in the kitchen. The executive chef and I chatted in his office for about 20 minutes. At the time, I remember him coming off as very arrogant, which is quite common in this field. I didn't think much of it at the time as the pay was decent and the shift was what I wanted. As I was leaving his office, I turned to leave through the dining room the way I had come in, which was closed at the time. It was another hour or so before service started, and he says to me, "No, not that way. Go through the kitchen. You're not good enough to go through the dining room." I was so surprised by what he said. I just did what he asked without a word. Later on, after I had got home, I phoned him up and said that after having a close look, I decided that his menu wasn't good enough and that I wouldn't be accepting his offer. I noped out of an interview one time, thanked them at the end, and said it wasn't for me. Those interviewing management level folks started arguing with each other in front of me during the interview. I figured, if this is the vibe at the management level, then I sure as heck don't want to be your employee. I answered an ad for a babysitting job. I was already working on a casual basis, but it was sporadic, so I thought some after hours babysitting would be welcome extra cash. The couple were both in the military and proceeded to tell me that I would be staying in the spare room and looking after their 6-month-old child around the clock, as well as doing the housework. I would have one day off every 2 weeks. They said it is cash in hand, so I could sign on to the dual unemployment benefit to make up the rest of the money. I left on the spot. They wanted a live-in housemaid and nanny, not a babysitter, and they were not able to pay for one. Why they thought it was up to me to illegally collect the dole to subsidize them, I don't know. I got hired at a very small knockoff dollar store in an old, failing mall. The owner was foreign with a very thick accent. He told me I'd get $6 an hour, but neglected to mention it was under the table. I spent about an hour stocking the very overly cluttered shelves before I was told to get more chips out of the back storage area. I walk back there and there's about a dozen men sitting on boxes all crammed into a small back room. I asked where the chips were, and these guys all glared at me. They started speaking in another language and rapidly motioned towards me. Then one guy got up and asked what I needed. I told him I was supposed to get a box of chips, and he got a box out of the pile and handed it to me. The entire time these guys are all staring at me. Everything back there looked shady as all heck, and it was very uncomfortable. A while later I had to use the restroom, which was also in the back. These guys all just wordlessly glared at me while I went into the woman's restroom. While I was in the restroom, someone tried to open the door. I was the only woman there. The owner told me he wanted me to come back that night late in the evening. Well, after them all closed, I didn't show up. I came in the next morning and lied about why I couldn't work there. He still gave me the few bucks from what little time I did work. I don't know what in the heck that guy had going on there, and I didn't want to find out. Edit forgot to add in the best part. I was 18 and this was supposed to have been my first job. Applied for a job at my longtime favorite restaurant, celebrated my birthday there every year. Owner asks me to come in for basically a tryout. As I communicated, I was looking at other job possibilities. I come in, and they just stick me on dishwashing for an hour. No biggie. Then their dishwasher doesn't show up, so the kitchen manager asks me to stay one for their lunch rush. Say I'll get paid for the hours. I do. Kitchen staff was nice, so I was happy to help out, even though I figured I'd be taking a different job. I fill out a time card at the end of the shift and tell the manager I probably won't be back. He understands and thanks me for the help. Fast forward a couple weeks, and he tells me to email the owner after I ask him if I should pick up my measly paycheck. I do. She basically tells me to duck off over text. Tells me it was staging, and that she told me I won't be paid. I respond that I understand that, but that I stayed an extra 3 hours which I was told I'd be paid for. She stops responding. I decide I want to be petty over the $40, so I get the Statqua labor department involved. Dude goes in there and makes her pay me for the hours including the first staging hour. Couple weeks later I got my $40. Never went back to that restaurant. Edit firstly. Petty is not how I see it 2 years later. I'm very glad I did this, and sharing the story with others in my city. I learned this practice was very common with local restaurants. Hopefully others learn to stand up for their labor too from my small experience. Secondly, this restaurant closed down a couple weeks after I got that paycheck. The owner made a long-winded complaint on the FB page about how the food culture had changed in the city and her restaurant didn't fit in anymore. Total bullshit. They were always popular. Most people theorized the terrible mismanagement and employee abuse had caught up to her. I was a waitress. The only waitress. At a just opened diner. The boss didn't have me sign any paperwork. Everything was under the table. But that wasn't what made me quit at the end of the night. In order to get me where he wanted me to go, he would pinch my skirt at my upper thigh. Not quite there, but very close. And pull me around like it was a leash. Needed me in the kitchen. Rather than call me, he would come out, pinch my skirt and pull to the kitchen. Needed me at the cash machine. Again. Come over to wherever I was. Didn't matter if I was serving a customer, and would grab my skirt to pull me. That act in itself made some customers uncomfortable. Mind you, one couple left an almost 50% tip in the end. But I think it was more out of pity and embarrassment on my behalf. I was supposed to come in the next day, but I called that night and said the job wasn't for me. I came in a couple days later to turn in my apron and he just took a wad of cash out of his pocket and paid me then and there. He was creepy. I think it was a smart move to quit. I was hired to be a waitress, which has a lower hourly wage due to tips. The entire shift they had me wash dishes in the sink, but paid me waitress wages. A few months later the restaurant was investigated for a number of fraud activity. Had an orientation for an alarm company. Next day manager calls and says don't worry about going into the office and to meet at Planet Hollywood. They like to get to know the employees better over lunch. Next day I go into the office and another employee whom I had not met says you must be Scandal 929. I was like They responded light skin. Pretty boys how the manager described me. Insane conversation. I found out no one else had ever been invited for a get to know you lunch. I'm out. Restaurant. Swept under my station. When we were closing, giant brown pile came out with broom from under low boy fridge. Pile began to scatter. It was hundreds of roaches. Never returned. It was a small independent insurance agency in 2006. My first day there, the owner, a true fossil, said ML and fax were strictly forbidden as he only believed in communication in person, by phone, or through mail. Left for lunch and never went back. I couldn't imagine the inefficiency I'd have dealt with had I stayed. They ultimately closed their doors, so it was definitely the right decision. Consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more of Reddit Universe.